Hello, everybody. I'm Amir Licht. The ECGI will give a few seconds for the participants to flock in. Right. Okay. Let's start. Welcome everybody to the ECGI Spotlight Seminar on AI in Corporate Law and Practice. Anyone who's been reading newspapers recently can tell that AI is all the rage. It's the next big thing, except for COVID-19, perhaps. AI will do everything, or so the newspapers, all sorts of pundits tell us. And if that's the case, does this mean that AI could also do corporate governance? What a terrifying thought. If that's the case, how? There's been a tremendous advance in the literature and research on AI and law, AI and corporate governance. It's beginning to make some steps, academically speaking. And to address these issues, we've invited Professor John Armour from University of Oxford to make a presentation in this spotlight event. John will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. This will be followed by comments by Professor Iris Chu from UCL and Professor Florian Moslein from Philipps University of Marburg. We will then have Q&A. Please use the Zoom feature of Q&A to post your question. Professor Ji-Young Min will coordinate this. Time allowing, we might be able to let you ask the questions. More likely, Professor Min will be presenting the questions. Before we begin, I would like to thank my partner in coordinating this seminar series, Professor Ji-Young Min from Michigan State University. We should also thank the ECGI team of human intelligence, Professor Marco Becht, our leader, Elaine McPartland, Vanessa Paget, and Noreen Khan from the ECGI. Also with us today, overseeing that we're doing all right, is Professor Mike Burkhardt, who runs the finance series of working papers and spotlight seminars. I believe that's it by way of introductory comments. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marco. And I'm just going to put my slides up. Just give me 1 second here. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm very grateful to Amir, to Ji-Young, to Elaine, to Marco, and the rest of the team for making this possible and for inviting me today. So I'm going to be talking about two working papers that are in the law ECGI working paper series. So one published last year called Augmented Lawyering, which is jointly with my colleagues Richard Parnham and Mary Sarko in the Saïd Business School, and the other published the year before called Self-Driving Corporations, which is jointly with my colleague Horst Eidenmuller here in the Oxford Faculty of Law. Now, these papers both deal with the application of AI. The Self-Driving Corporations is what I would call a think piece, so it's asking about how AI will affect corporate governance and corporate law in theory. The Augmented Lawyering paper is focusing on the application of AI in legal services, and in particular corporate legal services. Hence the title of today's session, which is Corporate Law and Practice. And so the practice part is actually legal practice, augmented lawyering in the context of corporate legal services. And that paper is based not just on theory, but also empirics, and we've got mixed methods, empirical study underpinning that. We've done interviews with over 50 professionals working in the sector, and we did a survey with 350 respondents from practicing lawyers in the UK. So the agenda for my short discussion today, I'm going to start by saying a few words about what is AI, so how we're approaching that question in this work. Then I'm going to say a little bit about AI's impact on work, that is the work of humans, and how that is affecting how humans view their roles, and then look at the impact on organizations, and finally we'll draw out some implications. And so in all of this, I'm going to zoom in on the case of legal services, the case of law firms as an example, because that's the one that we've studied in the most detail, but also reflect that back up to the more general issues around corporate law and corporate governance. So what's AI? Well, in this work, I take a functional definition, an artificial system performing tasks for which a human would use their brain. And I think that's these days relatively uncontroversial. And in the discussion also, we should distinguish between today's AI, that is what's possible with technology today, for which human or superhuman performance can be achieved only for very specific tasks. And the ones in which AI has been most successful to date are in image recognition and text translation. Where AI thus far has been weak is on common sense logic and transferring learning from one context to the other. So what that makes for is systems which have very specific, very focused expertise. In contrast, much of the media and popular discussion has been around what we might call superintelligence, or what practitioners in the field call artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And that's in the self-driving corporations paper. We talk about that as tomorrow's AI. That is AI that's not here, possible now, maybe possible at some point in the future. How far in the future? Well, experts disagree, and really how long is a piece of string? So we will not be focusing on that in today's discussion. We'll be focusing on the implications of what's technically possible now, today's AI. Underpinning AI are two different types of technological implementation, and these can be conceptualized respectively as top-down and bottom-up. So the top-down approach, sometimes called an expert system, starts with a set of rules for a particular task or area of operation. And those rules are derived from the knowledge of domain experts, that is, people who have expertise in the field that the system is going to be operating in. And so the knowledge in the system, the rules are hard-coded. They have to be constructed laboriously, and that is the roadblock on the successful scaling of these systems, is that it's very, very labor intensive to produce such knowledge maps. The strengths of this approach are that you can clearly explain what's been done, because the output is a deduction through the application of the rules, but the weakness flows from the difficulty and the cost of constructing the hard-coded rules. And that means that these systems are quite brittle to things that are outside their capability, and they also often require the user to input their queries in a form that the system has been designed to understand. So that was the dominant approach to AI until about 15 years ago. Since then, all the major progress has been with the bottom-up approach. And this uses a technique called machine learning, and it's sort of more advanced cousin deep learning. What these involve is training the system to figure out relationships that are in the data, but without specifying to the system what those relationships are. So we take a data set that we have labeled according to a variable that we're interested in, and then we have the system analyze what other features of the data set are best correlated with the variable of interest in a training set. And that then delivers a model which has been trained to predict the incidence of the variable of interest from the other features of the data. So if we then put that model to work on a different data set, but in which the relationships are similar, so a sufficiently similar data set, then it can find the variable of interest for us. And this works exceedingly well, particularly in the applications that I mentioned of image recognition and text translation. The drawback with this approach is that the models are essentially a black box. They depend on very complex statistical relationships, which may be very hard to understand, let alone explain. And so explaining the reasoning in these systems is much more challenging. But that's been where all the activity has been in the past few years. So in the machine learning or bottom-up approach, data is a key ingredient for success. So we can see the preconditions for functionality include having algorithms, having computer power, having data. The algorithms are relatively commoditized. So actually success in predicting output is much more dependent on the data than it is on innovation in the algorithm. So having a sufficiently relevant, sufficiently large, and appropriately labeled data set is crucial to success. So much of the challenge in operationalizing the use of machine learning depends on the assembly of data sets and the selection of data sets as being appropriate. So if we train the model on data that's relevant to one set of issues and then try to extrapolate from that to other sets of issues, we're obviously going to get poor results. So that's what I mean about the relevance of the data set. We have to have the data that it's trained on be close to what we're actually applying it to do. It must be large, because the bigger the data set, the better the results. And labeling means that we need to be able to tell the system what are the variables of interest, what's the thing that we're looking for. And in many contexts, that again is a labor-intensive process or a costly process, the labeling of the data at the outset. So this has a couple of implications for the deployment of AI in business and other contexts. So the first is that it's going to be less useful for decisions that are novel or highly idiosyncratic. That is, for which there will be fewer prior relevant data that could be used to train a model. So conversely, it will work best for applications where there are lots of prior examples that we can use to train a model. And where there are recurring decisions, then there will be fixed costs associated with assembling the data set and labeling the variable of interest. And that suggests that there can be increasing returns to scale as the data set, or economies of scale as the data set gets larger. So this idea of a bigger data set meaning better performance has been captured in the popular imagination by the business model of Amazon, and this is what they call their data flywheel. So basically, if you have more data, your machine learning model does a better job. That allows you to deliver a better product. Better product attracts more users, and more users using the system generate more data. So there is a positive feedback effect to more data generating a better product, generating more users. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of the technology and its preconditions for successful application. Let's now look at its application in the workplace. And we draw here on the future of work literature in economics, and that identifies three different dimensions in which technology impacts human tasks. And the one that attracts the most attention in the popular discussion is substitution. So technology substitutes for humans. And so, for example, Richard Susskind has famously argued that legal professionals and other professionals will fade from prominence as technology renders them redundant. So robots taking our jobs is the most common fear that is associated with consideration of AI by knowledge workers, just as people who engaged in manual work had their human tasks replaced by machines during the Industrial Revolution. Just focusing on substitution, though, overlooks two other important impacts of advanced technology such as AI on human tasks. The second is complementing humans who perform tasks that cannot yet be automated. So by substituting for humans in the things that the technology can do, we saw from that first part about the scope of AI's sphere of application that it's not capable of substituting completely for humans. And so idiosyncratic decisions, decisions that have few prior examples, these are things that cannot be effectively automated, at least not yet. And so humans who work on these sorts of things will find that their capacity is augmented by technology taking over the more repetitive tasks. So in theory, that can actually increase demand for humans who have the skills necessary to do these tasks that cannot be automated. The third dimension lies in the human tasks necessary to implement the technology. So the technology doesn't just drop from the sky ready to run. It needs to be designed. It needs to be trained for a particular context. That training requires the assembly of data. The data has to be clean. The data has to be secure. The data has to be labeled. All of this requires project management, quality control, and so there are many new roles that come with the implementation of the technology in the business context. So three dimensions then, and we can just see those again here. Substitution for repetitive or scalable tasks, augmentation of tasks that can't be automated, so tasks involving what are called creative intelligence, so idiosyncratic or one-off analysis, and tasks that augment the AI, that is, facilitate the operation of the AI in the workplace. So to give you a sense of how AI is being adopted, this is a snapshot of some use cases in legal services. And this is from a survey that my colleagues and I did of practicing lawyers in the UK. And what we've got here are a range of tasks like due diligence, which is the consideration of contracts prior to a large corporate transaction, e-discovery, which is the analysis of electronic materials prior to a court case, contract analytics, which is the review of contracts by a business to see whether or not they comply with its set of rules regarding the kinds of terms that it would agree to. These have the common characteristic of being quite repetitive. So the sort of tasks that junior lawyers generally don't like doing because they are quite tedious and repetitive. And they're also the sort of tasks that sufficient prior examples exist to enable the training of a machine learning or deep learning model on those prior examples, which can perform as well or indeed better than humans, and once up and running, can scale so the performance can be done more cheaply. So that's an example of AI substituting for humans. And the outputs from these tasks, which are, as I've said, relatively repetitive, they then augment the productivity of human lawyers doing other tasks that don't lend themselves, at least yet, to automation in the same way. So the productivity of those other lawyers is enhanced or augmented by the substitution of the technology for the first category of tasks. Now, let's turn to the third category, taking this example of legal services still. One of our interviewees explained the implementation of the technology in the following way. They said, you need effectively a solution to manage the matters, keep track of all of them, and manage who's working on them, the delegation, the workflow, etc. It's more like a production line kind of technology. So this idea of a production line actually captures really well the implementation of AI from the inside. So how that system that is substituting for the humans, how it actually works from the inside. And you can think of it unbundled in this way. So the pipeline that will be at the stage here, this red box, that's where it's substituting for the human in those repetitive tasks that I was talking about. And here at the end of the process, it will be providing an output which the human lawyer whose job cannot yet be automated will use as an input. That will augment them. But there are a number of other stages in the process. We need to specify the requirements at the outset. We need to design the model. We need to ingest the data and ensure its integrity. We need to make sure the data are labeled. We generate the outputs, and then those outputs need to be reviewed for quality control purposes. And the analysis of that stage goes back to label to be used in another iteration of the model. So all these different stages in the process are involving humans performing tasks, and these tasks are new tasks that were not were not being done prior to the implementation of AI. The other thing that is notable about these tasks is that they require a range of different disciplinary inputs. So they require skills from a range of different disciplines. So we see here in the context of legal services, legal skills are required at various stages to specify what the system is supposed to do, to make sure the data are labeled appropriately. But we also require data science skills. We also require process mapping experts. We require project management. We require design thinking. So a range of different skills and expertise is necessary. And so a key finding from our survey is that in the context of legal services, the deployment of AI is associated with people with domain expertise, that is the lawyers, and people with a range of other different expertise working together in multidisciplinary teams. And those multidisciplinary teams are the distinguishing feature of the roles associated with the deployment of the technology, the new roles, that is, they're multidisciplinary. Whereas the roles that they are replacing were more monodisciplinary. So that's the impact on work. What about at the organizational level? Well, we see here a number of internal challenges that flow from the preconditions for successful deployment of AI and the impact on the workplace. So one very obvious challenge concerns the streamlining of data. And that's within an organization, the organization needs to think collectively about how to capture as much data effectively to be able to train AI models where it wants to use them, and to ensure that those data are in a form that is capable of systematization. And this is the classic problem in many organizations of legacy systems that don't communicate effectively with one another, and also of the thought hasn't been given to data capture in a systematized way because it just wasn't thought to be relevant. So that's something that needs to be done organization-wide and on a consistent format. Secondly, the deployment of AI is not just a question of taking a computer system and replacing what a human did. The very nature of the task, the very nature of the operation could look quite different when it's been automated, as that little snapshot of the impact on work, I hope, conveyed. And so the sorts of people working in the organization, the way in which they're going about doing their job can look very, very different. And so process reengineering, again, it can be an organization-wide challenge. So closely associated with that are the challenges around human capital. So how does one recruit the kinds of people that one needs to do the new jobs? How does one train existing people who are going to be augmented by the technology to make the most of it? How does one motivate multidisciplinary teams? How does one pay them? How does one structure their promotion? And how does management coordinate all of this? So these are large-scale organization-wide challenges that more generally are spoken about in the business community under the banner of digital transformation. So digital transformation encompasses this organizational-wide systematic change to embrace the new technology and deploy it as effectively as possible. There's a boundary question. So I've suggested that these are internal challenges. There's also a boundary question, which is, do you want to do this internally or do you want to buy it in? So a make or buy question resides at the perimeter of this analysis. So if you conclude that it is too costly to reorganize the firm to do it internally. You might be able to buy it in from an outside provider, but then you have to rely on them to have done all the necessary steps effectively, and the procurement exercise is also a challenge. To see this in the context of law firms, there's a particular challenge for law firms with the recruitment and motivation of the multidisciplinary teams, because the distinguishing feature of law firms is still that they are partnerships and that the partners are lawyers, and so that creates a truncated promotion pathway for the multidisciplinary professionals who will be recruited to work in teams. So this is what's called the rocket shape model of the law firm, produced by a report by BCG a few years ago. And what we see here is that the top level is just lawyers, but there are lots of other people with different disciplinary backgrounds creating value for the firm. And that has implications then for recruitment and retention. And so one of our law firm interviewees captured this quite effectively by saying that what law firms don't have is a lot of times the technical know-how. I know a lot of wonderful, brilliant, talented data scientists that decidedly do not want to go to work for law firms. And that's at least in part because of the challenges regarding career progression. Whereas if we talk to somebody who works as a lawyer in a corporation, in an in-house corporate team, they speak rather about the wide disciplinary range of backgrounds that are represented in their team. And that suggests then that the corporation as an organizational form is better able to assemble and retain, recruit, and manage multidisciplinary teams than a partnership. And that finding was borne out in quantitative analysis of our data. So we found a negative correlation between the existence of multidisciplinary teams. So whether respondents said that they were working in a multidisciplinary team or not, they were less likely to do so if they were employed in a law firm than if they were employed in a corporation. There's an external challenge, a number of external challenges, but I'll thematize them with this slide regarding the deployment of AI, which concerns what we might loosely call user trust. So if we go back to the Amazon data flywheel, operationalizing this, to get more users, the users have to trust the way in which the firm is going to govern their data. That is, that their data must be handled in a way that's consistent with legal and ethical norms. So the firm has to have appropriate mechanisms in place internally to govern the use of the user data in training the model, and also the deployment of AI in the product. The user has to trust the way in which the firm's done that. And again, choices that the firm makes around the appropriateness of the model, let's just remind ourselves of the link between the training data and the quality of the decision. So firms need to be careful to make sure that they are applying AI in the context for which it is justified by the data that have been used to train it, and not to extrapolate from data which are in a different context, so that the results will be less useful to the user. So that again requires internal oversight and governance processes. These data governance look like compliance processes. This governance of the functionality and deployment, I would suggest, looks or should look a bit like product governance in the context of financial services. But in both cases, the user has to trust that, and that's critical to the business success, because if they don't, then they won't be able to attract the users which are necessary in turn to generate the data. So what are the implications then for all of this for both legal services and corporate governance? So firstly, law firms. One question arising from this quite starkly is whether it makes sense for law firms to continue to operate as partnerships. So what we've suggested is that the partnership form struggles to accommodate the multidisciplinary team that is characteristic of the deployment of AI. And at least in the UK, it's been possible for over a decade for legal services firms to switch their form. They're not required by regulation to operate as partnerships anymore. They could be corporations or multidisciplinary partnerships if they prefer. But the majority of law firms still remain as partnerships. So that provokes a question as to why law firms have not yet changed their form, why they've not embraced the corporate form, if it in fact offers advantages for the deployment of technology. And we offer two conjectures around this. So one is that technology, at least for the firms that haven't changed, the benefits of technology are not yet sufficiently large as to justify this change in organizational form. And to go back to what I said before about the boundary question, firms that struggle to embed multidisciplinary teams internally can buy analysis in from an outside supplier. So it's what we see is some law firms remaining as partnerships, but buying in AI services from more technologically oriented firms that are organized as corporations, so-called alternative legal service providers. Another complementary reason is that the partnership form is arguably one that is well suited to organizations that are for which human capital is very important. And in a traditional legal services firm, the human capital of the partners is crucial to their success. And for an organization that will remain focused on the human-only tasks that are augmented by AI that's bought in, the partnership form may continue to remain appealing. What about corporate boards? Well, one very clear implication of this is that AI is not going to replace corporate directors as strategic decision makers anytime soon, because the sorts of strategic decisions that are made in the boardroom are idiosyncratic, they're particular to the firm. And so they're outside the scope of the useful deployment of current AI. That said, AI can usefully help to inform scenario planning and to provide inputs to corporate boards, but it's not going to replace them. So the boards are in that category of human roles that will be augmented by AI, but will not, in the near term at least, be substituted. However, there are major implications, though, for what boards do regarding the organizational changes that AI will bring to the firm below board level. So there could be widespread substitution for roles below the board level where tasks are repetitive. And then the oversight of that transition, the oversight of the selection of when AI is appropriate, what processes are in place for data acquisition, what processes are in place for governance of the data and ensuring the appropriate use of AI in the product chain. These are major new challenges for the firm, which the board of directors, as the senior body with responsibility for oversight of the business, I don't think will be able to delegate. That will be a responsibility that will end up ultimately with them. And so I think this has an implication for what we might think of independent directors as doing. So one of the well-known challenges in the empirical literature is the struggle to find a relationship between board independence and corporate performance. And so the challenge can be summarized in how do we ensure that independent directors are sufficiently close to the business to be able to make properly informed decisions and yet sufficiently distant to be independent. And these data governance issues, I would suggest, are important but relatively generic. That is, the kinds of questions that will be raised will be similar across the deployment of AI, across the digital transformation. So that's the kind of issue in which somebody who is independent of a particular business but experienced in business generally could be capable of developing expertise in. And so I would suggest that independents could and probably should develop generic expertise in those sorts of questions, and that will be something that both corporate governance community generally, and I would expect the courts would increasingly come to expect them to do. So there's a lot more I can say, obviously, about pretty much all of these topics, but this is just intended to be an overview, and I hope we'll now hear some contrasting perspectives from my two commentators, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Let's move directly to the commentators. First will be Professor Iris Chu from University College London, and she will be followed immediately afterwards by Professor Florian Moslein from Philipps University of Marburg. Professor Chu, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amir. Thank you, John, for giving me the opportunity to comment on your papers. And thank you to ECGI for inviting me to this panel. There is very little to disagree with in what John has said. I think the first thing I would say is that as a human being, it probably brings us great comfort to know that there is evidence-based reasoning for our continued relevance. And that we won't be replaced by AI that soon. So thank you very much for that. I have also done some work on this with a colleague at the National University of Singapore, Dr. Ernest Lim, on looking at whether or not we would have driverless corporations and a replacement wholesale of the corporate board. And we also think not. And that is reason from the point of view of a kind of institutional theory and how we think corporate law and institutional change would come about. In terms of responding to these two very interesting papers, I think I spent a lot more time on the paper on driverless corporations, and that is because of my interest in corporate law. I agree with John in that I see boards as having increasing oversight responsibilities and governance responsibilities for the technologies that corporations deploy, and that boards have to become increasingly more clued up in these areas. I'm just wondering, in terms of a question for John, as to whether or not you think at some point in time, the corporate governance code or even corporate law may incorporate data governance and the governance over the adoption of radical technologies in corporations as part of kind of hard law or soft law in terms of what boards should do and the kind of responsibilities that boards would owe to the workforce as well, partly because workplace structurations and changes are bound to occur with the adoption of some of these technologies. So I'm just wondering to what extent you think this might become legalized within part of corporate law and corporate governance, and not just kind of external regulation in terms of the GDPR or other extensions from that. And I'm just wondering also whether or not the governance of a kind of AI deployment or data governance in corporations is itself a way for the human really to remain in control of this process, and that it is important to do so. I think one of the points that really struck me, and I was very, very attracted to this point, is the driverless subsidiary mentioned in John's paper, which you didn't talk about much in today's presentation. I can see the point about regulatory competition and offshore jurisdictions offering that kind of possibility in incorporation, that they will permit driverless subsidiaries, and that some MNCs would find it very attractive to do this. I'm just wondering to what extent parent company or MNC parent jurisdictions can extend extraterritorial reach in terms of their laws on the requirement to have natural directors, and whether that could be a way to prevent any race to the bottom, if we think that that is a development towards race to the bottom. In terms of the augmented lawyering paper, I very much agree that in terms of workplace organization, multidisciplinary teams, including tech experts, is likely to be the way forward, and that the corporation is a good structure that accommodates this malleability. I also think that multidisciplinary teams is a great development in terms of the sort of workplace diversity, inclusiveness, as well as the kind of enterprise-wide perspective building, which a lot of people have talked about as an antidote to kind of siloed forms of risk management. And so the MDT, I see it as a very positive organizational development. But I'm also wondering, in terms of lessons from the augmented lowering piece, whether the MDT that you have studied in corporate legal services, would that become more generally applicable as well, to all kinds of workplace reconfigurations in the corporate economy in general? I mean, do you see that as a model that many other corporations, other than professional services, consultancy-based businesses, would likely adopt as well? And one of the concerns I may have about kind of MDT organization, more generally speaking, is that it could well be that the more skilled echelons of the workplace would be able to kind of reorganize themselves around this sort of new structure and benefit from this sort of new structure. But the lower skilled echelons of the workplace would more likely be unable to take advantage of this, because we already see, for example, that customer service staff in organizations can be replaced by the deployment of chatbots. I mean, chatbots are not particularly intelligent AI, but it is still sort of creeping steps that we can see. Lower skilled workers where labor is being replaced by more sophisticated forms of automation. And at these levels, it may be more unlikely, or that organizations or corporations may not be incentivized to organize MDTs in order to be more inclusive, to incorporate both the human as well as the automated elements into workplaces at all levels, and not just the echelons of the higher skill. So I'm just wondering whether the organizational changes around MDT favor a particular type of worker, and whether that in the longer term draws out issues in relation to workplace and social inequalities. I mean, I do appreciate that this is a much wider comment, and it could be rather unfair to ask John to comment on it. But I would like to hear from John as to what are some of your perspectives on this. So I hope I've used up my 7 minutes effectively, and would like to hand over to Florian.
Thank you very much. Thanks both to the ECGI for the invitation, and for John for this inspiring presentation and the inspiring 2 papers. Let me just make 3 points. It's difficult to contradict, as Iris has already mentioned, but I would like to complement the ideas that John has presented with 1 more general remark and 2 more specific points that I want to make. The more general remark is that you've started with digital technologies or new technologies very generally, but then of course focused on AI and data technologies. Now, if AI is only one of these technologies, the question is whether we can really, from a methodological point of view, separate it from other digital technologies, such as distributed ledger technologies, platform technologies, and so forth. In practice, all these technologies interact and often come together. But from a academic point of view, it makes, of course, sense to look at just one technology, but we should not lose sight of the fact that there might be interactions. And for instance, if distributed ledger technologies allow for smart contracts and for automatic enforcement of agreements, that has an impact on the governance of corporations as well. And the same is certainly true for the platform economy and the changing nature of corporations in that respect. So one question really is really relates to the research design, if you want. Is it really possible to take only only artificial intelligence into account, or should we rather take all these other technologies into account as well? My second point relates to the multidisciplinarity implication that you have mentioned. I very much agree that multidisciplinarity is necessary, both in law firms, but also in corporations, and that the use of AI will contribute to this need of multidisciplinarity. However, I think the question whether the professional partnership is still suitable for future law firms does not only depend on the need for multidisciplinarity, but also on the hierarchy of disciplines. How do these disciplines and how does the need of these disciplines interact with each other? The reason why I'm submitting this argument is that I would think that law firms have always had a certain need for multidisciplinarity. Think of construction lawyers, think of pharmaceutical lawyers. They always had a need to take into account the insights of other disciplines of medicine or of engineering and so forth. Nonetheless, the form of the professional partnership has evolved, and that is mainly because the law was in the driving seat, and the other disciplines were only contributing to the core task, which was a legal task. So the question is whether the use of AI really changes this hierarchy, or on the other hand, even if other disciplines, technological disciplines, are necessary, the law might still be in the driving seat. My third point relates more to the corporate law implications that you have mentioned. Your main claim, I think, was that strategic decision-making is outside the scope of artificial intelligence, which I think is true in principle, but not in all cases. And that is because the question which decisions a board is taking depends on a variety of factors. And these factors have an impact on the type of questions that a board needs to decide. And I would argue that strategic decision-making that the board is competent for is not always something that is outside the scope of AI. This might often be the case, but not necessarily so. The question which decisions a board takes depends on national law, of course, but it also depends on the sector, the size of the specific company. So it depends on specifics of the individual firms. And the consequence of that is that in a small investment firm, for instance, or in a financial firm, the decisions that are taken by the board may comply much more with the capacities of artificial intelligence than in the traditional industry, for instance. So I think it depends on the sector, on the size of companies, whether your claim is really true. And at that point, the platform economy may also change something, because it changes firms to a more number-specific type of decision-making that is necessary. So the number crunching capability of AI may play a more strategic role than in traditional companies. And if that is the case, the follow-up question is what company law, whether company law needs to be changed, whether, for instance, directors' duties applied differently if AI supports management and board decisions, whether conflict of interests rules need to focus more on structural questions than on situational questions, and so forth. My final point, I agree very much with what you have said on the importance of new ethical and compliance responsibilities of the board. I think that corporate digital responsibility will play a key role in future, and that has much to do with the user trust argument that you have brought forward. I recently published a paper in German so far only with the title Corporate Digital Responsibility, and I think the question is the question will be not so much whether there is such type of responsibility, but how to implement the responsibility. Should we have different structural rules, like the independent direct question that you raised, or is it more of a substantive question that directors need to face? And I stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your answers and also to the general Q&A.
Hi. John, I suggest in light of our time situation, I suggest that you address the points made by the commentators after Ji-Young present maybe a couple of points or questions from the Q&As. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just address all of them, or whichever you prefer to address afterwards. Ji-Young?
Hi, thank you so much for a great and very interesting paper and presentation, and to the great discussions. And we got many good, great questions, and I want to introduce one of them, a few of them. And Ruth Aguilera, asked the question, asked how the law firm makes sure that these junior lawyers do not into the machine learning bias data. So in her view, the elephant in the room is how to rein in this entire AI field, which is evolving much faster than regulation is able to keep up. So Professor Lasik at Harvard Law School has proposed 4 regulatory approaches, including such as markets, hard law, soft law, and self-governance. And what is your thinking about how to govern this AI beast, which has taken a life of its own beyond the internet as we know it?
I guess this is a huge question, and I'm going to narrow it down, acknowledgedly artificially, to the scope of legal services. And so at the moment, what's happening is if you go to a law firm and you ask for some advice, and they've used AI in the preparation of that advice, and it turns out that some defect in the AI has meant that the advice is wrong, then the firm is liable, basically. So they are standing behind the output of the technology that they're using in the advice. And so that helps to make them conservative about the deployment. It also helps to embed practices like running 2 systems in parallel to cross-check the results and make sure that that it's robust in that way. But as we go forwards, we are inevitably going to see other sorts of organization offering the AI services. And at the moment, you can buy an analysis from what's known in the sector as a law tech firm, so a startup that is offering a piece of technology based in legal services, and they will be offering that both to law firms who can then use it to do what I've just described, or they will offer it direct to corporate users. And if you buy it direct as a corporate user, then it's up to you really what legal advice implications you take from it, and the contract will specify the allocation of liability, and they will try and exclude as much as they can. So that then, extrapolating forwards, we'll see price pressure where the firm that I've described as a law tech startup, that's going to be organized as a corporation. It will be more multidisciplinary, and they may be able to offer this much more cheaply than if you go to the law firm and we don't know, how they're pricing the ultimate output and what value the humans have added to it. So that then creates an impetus to use the AI in a way that is less controlled, and we may worry then about these regulatory questions. And so I think actually that it's desirable for there to be sectoral regulation of applications, sectoral regulation to ensure that key issues around data privacy and equality, that is avoiding bias that tends to discrimination. So not simply bias in a statistical sense, but bias in a legally relevant sense, is impacting the user. And so the problem at the moment with implementing this is that the regulatory regimes are disparate. They are enforced by different agencies. They have differing intensities of enforcement. They have differing penalties. And these make it actually very difficult for firms to comply, even if they want to. Not to mention the speed of change of the technology, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's a role for sectoral regulation that helps to bridge the gap for firms between these more general kinds of issue from a legal point of view and the products that they're using in the workplace. And I actually personally think that regulation along the lines or on a similar structure to what we see in financial services with product governance, whereby the firm has to have in place a process for overseeing the deployment of its product to ensure that it's in the interests of the user. That's actually quite a helpful intellectual structure to think about. Any firm that's got a data advantage, such as a firm that's using AI in the user-facing context, put the onus on the firm to be demonstrating the utility of the analysis and how they're complying with all these different requirements as part of their internal governance processes.
We have too many good questions, but I will, because of the time constraints, I will ask one more question from Vanessa Knapp. So law firms employ and work with others with the different specialties, for example, HR, IT, and accountants, but so far have been very reluctant to share profits with people in those categories, finding other ways to remunerate and incentivize them. Are people with AI skills any different? If so, how?
So far, the answer is no, and that is the source of the problem with multidisciplinary teams. So, how does a firm attract really high quality people with non-legal expertise to work in the team? And they can do it if it's not, as it were, absolutely central to their business model. They can buy it in or have it as an auxiliary function with a reasonable degree of success. So you could buy in the service from a firm that's organized as a corporation and has a multidisciplinary teams embedded in it, or you could acquire a firm like that as a subsidiary, right? So several law firms have acquired law tech firms as subsidiaries to deliver the services in that way. But then you've still got the constraint that the strategic choices for the subsidiary are going to be made by an organ at the head of the law firm that is monodisciplinary. It's all lawyers, and they may not understand the strategic growth impetus for the subsidiary's business model. So that may make it less appealing for the very best people with the relevant skills. So it kind of depends how important to the law firm the technological function is. And what I've suggested is that there's going to remain an important part of legal services which is human only. And if that's what the firm's business model focuses on, then they can tolerate having the AI input come in either from a third party or as a subsidiary and view that as an auxiliary function. But if the firm is offering services that are squarely capable of being performed by technology, then I think the corporate form makes more sense, and that involves much more straightforward profit sharing. And we see rapid growth in so-called law companies, which may or may not offer legal advice, but offer relevant services in the legal sector, which are scaled by and based on technology.
Right. I believe we've hit our time constraint point. So unless, John, you would like to make a very quick comment, we will wrap up by thanking everybody.
I just wanted to, so I want to say thank you to the commentators, because these are super questions, and I would love to spend some time answering them. There's one in particular I just want to draw out, which I think I can give a really quick response to, which is Iris's comment about, will we in future see these sorts of issues actually being formally embedded in corporate law and governance? And one thing I think that is quite salient is the UK government's review of corporate governance that was just their consultation paper was published last year, and this is exploring the mandating of greater reporting requirements and greater director personal responsibility for reporting. And one of the things that they say will be a mandatory minimum is what they call resilience risk, and that includes specifically cybersecurity and other related issues. And what I can see is that that's the thin end of the wedge coming here, and we'll see that growing out to include other data governance things over time.
Great. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, John. Thank Ji-Young for moderating the Q&As. Thanks to the ECGI team, Elaine, Vanessa, Noreen, and thanks everybody for joining us for this seminar. Stay tuned for the next one. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks, Amir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.